Good evening and welcome. My name is Jenna Johnson and I am Deputy Chief of Design and Project Management for DCR and Project Manager for Quinobequin Road and Trail Improvements. Before we get started, we can let the attendees file in and we can turn the slide over to Jeffrey Morrison-Logan, from our design consultant VHB, to run through some of our Zoom platform procedures. Jeffrey.
Great. Thank you, Jenna, for that. I appreciate it. We can see that the attendees are still coming in here, so why don't we just give it about maybe 5 or 6 more seconds here as we're getting about 20 to 30 people that are logging in. And let me just wait to see that that tapers off, which I think it is. Great. So thank you, Jenna, again. So in terms of the logistics for this evening, we're really excited to be using the Zoom platform as we did in our first public meeting with you a few months ago. And as a reminder, after the presentation that you'll hear from the design team, that we're going to be asking you to join the conversation. And there's several ways that you can join this evening. By raising your hand, we're going to actually go to you and ask you to come off of your mute button and be able to join the conversation through audio. So find the mute button and find that raise your hand button. It would be great for this evening, and also find that mute button as well. And then secondly, we have a Q&A function that we're going to be using. So on your dashboard, the Zoom dashboard, look for that Q&A feature. And at any point during the presentation this evening, you can ask a question, and we'll come back to those during the end of the presentation and into the discussion this evening. And then lastly, we also have a chat feature that's available. That chat feature is really meant to have some dialogue that's going amongst the people that are attending for this evening, but really less about questions that are targeted towards the design team as well. So feel free to chat, but we'd actually ask you, if you want a question to be answered, use the Q&A feature. So with that, Jenna, back to you.
Thank you. And as Jeffrey mentioned, the meeting is being recorded and will be viewable at a DCR web link. So that's a wonderful thing. So welcome. Next slide, Jeffrey. On behalf of Governor Baker, Lieutenant Governor Polito, Secretary Theoharides, and Commissioner Montgomery, we're delighted you can be here. Thank you so much for taking your valuable time to join us. We have a really big DCR design review team that I'd like to thank as well. Jenny Norwood is Director of our External Affairs. Ann Fessinger is Director of Public Outreach. So thank you for organizing with our design consultant and Jeffrey Morrison-Logan this Zoom platform. Patrice Kish is Chief of Design and Engineering, and we have a big design and engineering crew. Jeff Parenti is Deputy Chief of Transportation Engineering and Construction. And from Jeff's group, Jason Santos, Mark McLean, Dan Driscoll, and Yvonne Jones have all given us their time and expertise. From Resource Protection, Jeffrey Harris, Cultural Resources, Ellen Birkland, our ecologists, Casey Dugan and Ali Akambi, our ecologists, have also reviewed drawings and made recommendations. Erica Aubin and Kevin Hollenbeck have helped us out from DCR Operations, and Danielle Mellett, DCR Landscape Architect, is managing the project with me. So thanks everyone again for your time and technical expertise. We also want to thank the legislators and City of Newton representatives who have supported this project. We see that Rep. Balzer and others are in attendance, and also Pete Sutton from MassDOT. Thank you for being here. If you could please raise your hand at the beginning of question and answer, Jenny will invite you to speak first. So on to our mission statement. DCR mission statement is something we actually think a lot about to protect, promote, and enhance our commonwealth of natural, cultural, and recreational resources for the well-being of all. And as we've said before, at Quinobequin, this really represents our challenge to protect the environment as we get access to our parklands. Next slide. The meeting purpose is to introduce the goals, which I will do shortly, and kind of a project summary. I'll introduce the project team and then turn it over to Pete Sorensen, our VHB project manager, who will introduce his VHB design team, our DCR consultants, as well as the 3 alternatives. We are very excited to share those with you. And then we'll turn it over to Jeffrey Morrison Logan again, who will present the alternatives matrix. And he and Jenny Norwood, who I mentioned is Director of External Affairs, will monitor the question and answer period to discuss the alternatives, to get your comments. That is the major goal of this meeting. We'll present project and next steps. So the project goals are to improve safety for drivers, cyclists, and walkers. I think everyone agrees Quinobequin, while charming, is very curvilinear and can be quite dangerous, especially for pedestrians. We want that, that safe access to be accessible. We want to improve the ecosystem function along the Charles River as we improve access and preserve the landmark scenic character of the roadway and the parkland. So now is a good moment to kind of set the project process in context, give you a little summary of what we've done. The notice to proceed was issued in April. We spent May walking the site and doing a site analysis, including survey work. We then had our first public outreach meeting, a listening session. Many of you were in attendance in June. During July and August, we had several DCR design review meetings. In September, we had additional DCR design review meetings and a City of Newton coordination meeting just a couple weeks ago. And now here we are with our second concept alternative meeting. We're excited to present these to you. We feel the alternatives we're going to present tonight really reflect listening to you, your interests and your priorities for Quinobequin, and we're interested to hear your feedback. So after tonight, and I'll summarize this again at the end of the meeting, we'll have a public comment period, which will close October 23rd. We'll be synthesizing the comments we hear tonight, as well as those on the DCR website, and develop a preferred scheme, which VHB will finalize at the end of November. So with that kind of progress context, we can go to the project team. So again, you can see the depth and breadth of VHB's consultant team. Primarily Pete Sorensen and Jeffrey Morrison Logan with VHB, and we have IBI doing landscape architectural design. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce your team in depth and present the alternatives.
Great, thank you, Jenna, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this meeting. My name is Pete Sorensen. As Jenna said, I'm the project manager for the design team. We do, in fact, have a real in-depth design team of environmental scientists, structural engineers, construction engineers, surveyors, public outreach, landscaping, geotech. So we have the full gamut in addition to the IBI team, which brings a strong recognition of landscape architecture to the team. We have lighting sub-consultants. So we have an in-depth team behind us here for these concepts. Next slide, please. On behalf of the project team, we're very excited to have the opportunity to actually present these 3 concepts. As we had mentioned earlier, following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. We hope this will foster some creative input, discussions, and certainly we would love to hear your opinions on the alternatives that we're presenting here this evening. This meeting is an important part of our design process. It'll help us define the direction and focus for the project as we move forward to the next phase of concept development. Just as a reminder to everybody, or for the newcomers to the meeting, the study area includes the Charles River Reservation from the river's edge along the residential property line on Quinobequin Road. It starts at the northwest on the left side of your sheet at the I-95 128 overpass, and it ends at the intersection with Ellis Street This will provide the long overdue connectivity to Hemlock Gorge. Next slide, please. Before we jump into all the alternatives, I'd just like to take a few minutes to discuss some of the founding principles behind the selection of the decision-making process. There are several components, things like regulatory requirements, design criteria, permitting requirements, and certainly along the corridor, there are physical constraints. And we do look at this from a constructability standpoint, whether we can actually build the concepts that we're presenting. But there's much more than that that makes a successful and sustainable project. I think first and foremost, it's the stakeholder input. It's the users and the abutters, the stewards of the facility. We had a meeting back in June, as Jenna had mentioned earlier, and we took what we heard at that listening session. And several of you provided comments during the meeting and comments after the meeting, along with some discussions with the City of Newton and comments that we received from the City of Newton. The goals that Jenna just discussed, the DCR goals, taking all this input into consideration, we collectively came up with the following assessment criteria as we prepare our alternatives for this project. We have a full matrix that actually compare these alternatives later in the presentation we'll get to. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm not going to read all the assessment criteria definitions, but there's a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning. The Charles River shoreline is a highly sensitive area for the presence of architectural resources. So we want to just express the importance that all the construction activities in the undisturbed areas between the roadway and the river really need to minimize any excavations. Quinobequin Road is listed on the National Historic Places, National Register of Historic Places. Alternatives will really need to focus on minimizing any change to the character of the parkway and its setting. The wooded area along Quinobequin Road contains many vegetated wetlands and small tributary streams associated with the Charles River. All these are subject to the regulation under the Wetlands Protection Act. So the goal here is to minimize any encroachment within the wetlands. Next slide, please. The undisturbed wooded areas surrounding the footpaths are home to many wildlife species that are native to the watershed. So any proposed tree clearing would occur in the riverfront area, and it would require replanting and restoration to maintain the wildlife habitat. And finally, a significant portion of this project is within the 100-year floodplain. I think it's some interesting stats as we went through the analysis for the existing conditions. We found that 20% of Quinobequin Road itself is in the floodplain, and over 80% of the existing footpath is in the 100-year floodplain. And I think the big takeaway here is that we have to be very sensitive to any filling that we do in these areas, and we will have to mitigate that so that we provide a net zero impact. Next slide, please. So what we're really saying here is that we can't excavate, we can't cut down trees, we can't encroach into the wetlands, and we can't fill. It really shows how environmentally sensitive this area is. And I think those are important things to keep in mind as we look at these concepts. Next slide, please. So now here's the part that I'm sure you've all been waiting for, the introduction of the three alternatives. For clarity, we've stacked all three alternatives so you can see the difference between them. Alternative one, we've called the 21st Century Parkway. This is probably the most creative of the three, and certainly will give us all a lot to think about. The proposal here is to actually change the traffic patterns to a one-way in the northbound direction from Route 9 to Route 16. We're proposing sidewalks along the residential side. By reducing the roadway width with the one-way alternative, this allows us to provide a 10-foot shared use path and still maintain a minimum of a 5-foot buffer in the gained space. I should point out that we do have a dimension line in this section that shows the existing 24-foot path. I'm sorry, the 24-foot roadway. So we are widening the footprint by maximum of 5 feet, typically 5 feet, but there are definitely some areas that it's a little bit less throughout the corridor. The existing footpath under this alternative would be unchanged with the exception of things like trail maintenance and rebuilding perhaps the existing boardwalks and making sure that they're properly permitted. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Pete, if you'd like to go over the second and third alternative here, just briefly, that would be great.
Alternative 2 actually is named the Charles River Greenway because of its similarity to the other Greenway trails within the DCR network. It'll maintain the existing roadway width of 24 feet, and it'll continue with its current traffic patterns. Again, we're going to add sidewalks along the residential side. The real difference here is the 10-foot shared use path will be located off-road, mainly within the reservation and loosely following the existing footpath. And this is to minimize impact to the trees and the environment. And finally, the third alternative, share the road. This is similar to alternate 2 in as far as we're maintaining the existing roadway with traffic patterns are the same, and we're adding sidewalks along the residential side. The existing footpath would be upgraded to provide a more user-friendly pedestrian trail by upgrading the path to a 4 to 6 foot trail with a permeable surface. We'll be providing additional boardwalks to span wet areas and achieve connectivity over some of the more challenging topography out there. But the real priority here for this alternative is enhancing on-road bike experience and safety for cyclists. We'll do that by adding signage, striping, in different traffic calming measures that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. As part of alternative 3, there's been several inquiries and discussions on more progressive treatments for the roadway in the form of bike boulevards, advisory bike lanes. We have looked into these types of facilities are currently in experimental phase with the Federal Highway Administration. And from what we've seen so far and what we've reviewed with the design team and DCR, there is a concern that Quinobequin Road may not be an appropriate location based on things like the traffic, the volumes, the vehicle speeds, and they really would also create several safety concerns because of perhaps the circuitous geometry of the roadway. So that's not to say if we go in this direction, we won't keep an open mind and look at some of those more progressive alternatives. I think the bottom line is that it's not going to really change the roadway section as we're showing it here, and it's something that we can work through. As we go through these 3 alternatives, it's anticipated that all of them will actually include drainage and water quality upgrades throughout the corridor. Also, safety upgrades will be consistent among the 3 alternatives. Things like adding guardrail in the appropriate locations, improving lighting, improving sight lines. Next slide. So the project is approximately a mile and a half long. So we broke it up into 4 separate areas so that it would be more legible during the presentation. I want to point out that all the plans that we're presenting here tonight were actually laid out and modeled on a survey-based plan so that we could vet each one of these alternatives to confirm that they fit and start to identify the extent of the impacts from these alternatives. The red lines you see on the plan actually represent critical sections along the corridor. That these are areas that we wanted to really take a close look and make sure there wasn't any deal breakers in these alternatives. Next slide, please. We'll start with alternate 1 in area A. Just as a reminder, this is the 21st Century Parkway, the one-way operation with the adjacent shared use path. All 3 of these alternatives have a color scheme that is consistent throughout. The purple you see will be the 10-foot shared use path. The orange is the 5.5-foot sidewalk. The green is the existing footpath. The yellow represents areas that we found along the corridor that we could add potentially parking and pull-off areas. The blue represents boardwalks where we're elevated over wetlands or over topography and outlook locations. And the random powder blue line that you see running through the plan, that's actually the limits of the 100-year floodplain. As mentioned before, the project starts at I-95 128 overpass. And in this section, we're providing, we have room to provide a 10-foot shared use path adjacent to the roadway. It's anticipated that this section will be continued to Route 16 in the future, and this will happen under a separate project. This location and this treatment, it will be consistent throughout the 3 alternatives. As you can see in the typical, we're calling for a minimum of 5-foot separation between the roadway and the path. However, there's several areas along the corridor that provide opportunities to maximize separation without impacting the trees. You can see here, this was an opportunity to go up tight against the tree line and getting that extra separation between the roadway and the path. These areas allow us to do a lot of things. They're areas for parking, emergency pull-offs, stormwater features, and even additional landscaping. As you can see, there's you can see the yellow pull-off area that we've shown here. So it's a great opportunity to really enhance the corridor and provide flexibility in the corridor. Next slide, please. One thing I'd like to point out in this section is the reworking of the intersections. So we did take a look at all the intersections along the corridor. In this case, if you can focus on Carlton, you'll see that we've removed some of the excessive pavement and still meet truck turns and the ability to process traffic through here. But that space can now be repurposed as landscaping or even water quality features. So that's a big benefit to the project. Next, if you can turn your attention to the blue, the two blue areas at River's Edge, those represent potential outlooks. All these outlooks will have accessible connections from the shared use path. So regardless of where we put them along the corridor, there'll be we'll be looking to provide an accessible link, if you will, or a loop from the shared use path to these locations. For those familiar with the Irwin Road area, our first critical section is where we have wetlands on both sides of the roadway. The concern here is that we may not be able to fit the section in without impacting wetlands. If you look at the cross section, these are actual cross sections of the area cut through the model. And you can see that, you know, the reality is that we're probably going to have some minor grading impacts to the wetlands, but we're not physically in the wetland with the shared use path. So we will have to mitigate that. Next slide, please. As we approach York Road, you can, those familiar with the area, there are several mature trees along the edge of the road. They're just, you know, maybe 18 inches off the edge of the road. And with this section, because we are widening the footprint, they would be impacted. So, you know, here's an area where we can pull off to avoid hitting those mature trees, and we can snake through this. There's a grove of trees with a lot of area between them, and we can minimize the overall impact to the roadway character by not taking those trees out. Again, we have areas for pull-offs and parking. You know, I think it's more apparent in this area when we were out there during our site walks that there are a lot of deliveries. There are landscapers that need to pull off, you know, maintenance vehicles and things like that. And, you know, the other concern is with this one-way roadway, we want to make sure that there's enough room for emergency pull-offs for vehicles to pull over as, you know, an ambulance or police or fire truck is trying to pass. The critical section shown at the bottom of the screen has to do with one of the assessment criteria, archaeological preservation. This area stood out during our site walk, and so we wanted to make sure that we didn't require extensive excavation to put the roadway section in here. It seemed apparent based on the section that this was probably some of the original topography out here. And we actually confirmed that in looking at the old plans. Quinobequin Road was actually designed back in 1900, and we looked at the old contours and the maps, and it was almost identical to what you see today, except for the benching that took place in putting together, in installing the roadway pavement. Next slide, please. Area D has two critical sections. The first one is Dresser Pond. Dresser Pond also has a culvert, a cross culvert that actually is an overflow from Dresser Pond with a big head wall. So this became a real pinch point in the cross section. So we wanted to make sure that we could fit everything in here. We did have to, in all the alternatives, we have to slightly shift the geometry of the roadway. But as you can see from the section, we're pretty confident that we can fit it in there. We can fit here's a section where we'll actually need guardrails for vehicle protection. We can fit the guardrails, the sidewalk, and the full section within there. Because of the proximity of the shared use path to the roadway, there's been several discussions whether the addition of the sidewalk under this alternative becomes redundant and the potential for it to possibly be eliminated. This is especially in like real tight areas like we're looking at. So, you know, we're interested in some of the input. I think strategically, there's a couple things. We could eliminate the sidewalk, or we can strategically locate it similar as it is today. There's it's an intermittent sidewalk. We could strategically place links between streets with crossings to the trail. So that was an area of discussion that we thought it would be worth reaching out and see if there was any thoughts on that under this alternative. Next slide, please. The final location, the final critical section really is the steep slopes that are along the river as you approach Route 9. There's approximately a 20-foot drop from the roadway to the edge of the river. Fortunately, under this scenario, we have enough room to fit the section in with limited tree removal. There will be some tree removal on the side of the road, but certainly the section can fit in. Next slide, please. On to alternative 2. Alternative 2 is the Charles River Greenway. Again, it has we're talking the 24-foot roadway with a two-way traffic operation, and the shared use path is separated from the roadway. Similar to alternative 1, we can provide pull-offs and parking and stormwater features in the area where we're pulled off. We will be providing, again, accessible connections to the proposed outlooks, and we'll even have connections to the existing footpaths where it deviates. Generally, the path follows the existing footpath to minimize any impact, but there are several areas in the alignment that we will need to pull off. In this case, you can see in the bottom right hand of the page, we had to pull off of the existing path because it's located within the wetlands. So we wanted to avoid that. Next slide, please. Again, we reworked the intersection. The Carlton is a good example of that. It's a little bit different configuration than the one-way section, but certainly we do regain some of that green space for landscaping and water quality features. If you look at the critical section, under this scenario, we actually miss the wetlands. So it's much more palatable section through here. Next slide, please. As you can see from this the critical section, the path sits on the existing ground, so the only real excavation here is the path itself. So the concern of excavation is limited to the path. However, it is outside the disturbed area. One of the things that I wanted to point out, it's really an important discussion point here, is when we're putting the shared use path within the woods, the construction of this path really takes out quite a swath of trees. You know, we're looking at a 10-foot path with 2-foot shoulders on both sides, 14 feet. And by the time you actually clear the site, get your equipment in here, take a look at trees that you're actually impacting. We're seeing in some of these areas, you may have a 20-foot swath of trees that are removed, a significant concern for the local habitat. Next slide, please. In the final area, D, our first critical section here is Dresser Pond. Again, you can see that the section easily fits in with some minor tweaking towards the river. We can easily fit the sidewalk next to Dresser Pond. To keep the paths within the design guidelines and to minimize impacts, we will need to span the topography with a boardwalk structure. And as you can see in the sketch, we've actually shown it with helical piles. That's to minimize any of the excavation. You can see that it's standalone, and we're spanning over at the section. The head wall is actually a ravine that we would need to span over at this location. Next section, please. As we approach Route 9, the boardwalk gets closer to the roadway. And when this happens, this allows us to push the roadway or tie it into, at least on one side, into the side slopes. And we'll carry that boardwalk all the way up to the Route 9 intersection, where we will be providing a trailhead. Next slide, please. And the final concept, alternative 3. That's to share the road. Again, very similar to 2, where we have 1 and 2, where we have parking and stormwater features, a lot of the same things. The difference here is we're providing an upgraded walking path with a permeable compliant 4 to 6 foot surface. Again, the path will generally follow the existing alignment, except for where there is a need to avoid some natural features and wetlands. We'll be upgrading the existing boardwalks that are out there to make sure that they're permitted, properly permitted. Next slide, please. Again, we're doing a lot of the same rework and the intersections and doing the same safety improvements we talked about earlier. Critical sections and wetlands. In the critical sections, the wetlands are being missed once again, similar to alternate 2. Next slide. Our critical section concerns is the same here as we had in alternate 2. Here, certainly the path width is much smaller, so we obviously reduce impacts, but we still have the same concerns. Next slide. At Dresser Pond, in this area, the topography, as we mentioned, really fluctuates, and there's a ravine. The intent for this alternative is to show that there is the ability to utilize U.S. Forestry standard guidelines to keep the path on the existing ground, not go into a full ADA compliant structure like we did in alternate 2, but this allows us to keep the path on the ground to the greatest extent practical. Next slide, please. And finally, again, as we approach the Route 9 intersection, we want the path to have an accessible connection to Hemlock Gorge. So we would be providing a boardwalk similar to alternate 2, so we can traverse that steep slope. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Williams from IBI, who's going to talk about some of the what we're calling the kit parts, or the different components and details of some of the things that I've been talking about.
All right, thanks, Pete. Like you said, I'm Rick Williams, IBI Group. I wanted to walk you through some of the kind of how we potentially could do applications of the kit parts that we talked about in our first listening session. The first one I want to talk about is the paving types, and in particular paving location. Some of the images to the right here are fairly representative of the different alternatives that we have. Alternate 1, we're seeing kind of in the purple, with the purple highlight underneath the shared use path in the section. We're seeing it similar to the image on the right, although this is a 2-lane road. We would be suggesting going to a 1-lane road, but you're seeing that the asphalt path is relatively parallel to the edge of the road. It has undulation in both horizontal and vertical alignment, which is a benefit. If we run into a situation where we don't really want to be against the road because we've got an existing stand of really mature trees, we have the ability to pull off and kind of maneuver around them and try to reduce the amount of impact to those root zones. On alternate 2, the second image down, it's essentially an asphalt trail in the woods. It's meant to be not connected to the roadway per se, but more of a true woodland trail, shared use trail that still is maintained, still has the ability to have some volume on it. And it's not meant to be a small, quiet trail like alternate 3, which is suggesting that it is using the existing trail that's there today and enhancing it and making it more accessible, providing an accessible surface, which we're proposing or suggesting in this image, a stabilized stone dust path, which is more natural feeling. It's got some grit to it, so you feel like you're still walking on a dirt trail with smaller shoulders, and it's a much more intimate walk, which is what's out there today. So there's kind of the 3 different alternatives in terms of material. There's 2. There could be more, but the big difference in these 3 alternatives is where the path is and what we're asking it to do. And the third option, obviously, we're focusing most of the cyclists and heavy, biking traffic up on the road still, whereas alternate 1 and alternate 2 can be pulled off at times. Next slide, please. Next, wanted to talk a little bit about passive stormwater. I know that Pete had mentioned it in a few places in the plan views. We're looking at lots of different ways to handle stormwater and to get some infiltration and storage capacity out there, because we know that in a lot of cases we're in the 100-foot floodplain. Lots of water in the area generally, so we're looking to find ways to create space for that, to treat it, basically take out the suspended solids and allow water to infiltrate back into the groundwater. Depending on the size of the area that we have available, so this is at the Carlton, this is kind of the model of what we were seeing alternate 1 to kind of look like roughly. There's a larger space in the middle where that intersection has been reconfigured, where we actually could maybe get a rain garden in there. It has like a sediment forebay and has the room to do that. But in areas maybe on the left where we're seeing it, maybe not, the volume of space is not there, so that really we can do maybe a vegetated swale, but there are places where we can pick up water and treat it and transport it. And in other locations, similar to kind of on the far right, which is the bioretention swales. And these are kind of in between a rain garden and a vegetated swale. Similar treatment, have infiltration qualities, has a little bit more plant diversity within it, not quite as much as a rain garden though. But in all of these locations, in all 3 of the alternates, there are locations where we can do various versions of this passive stormwater approach. Next slide, please. Next, I wanted to just quickly touch on the bridge crossings. We're calling them bridge crossings. Pete had, I think, referred to them as small boardwalks. These are the boardwalks or bridges that are in the woods today. You can see on the left side photo, it's a typical little wood structure that someone built very graciously, but is not permitted. So we would like to go through and make them more accessible and permit them and make sure that they're abiding by all the regulations of, making sure that we don't have fall factor issues where we've got heights and surface to deck elevations that are greater than 30 inches. Thus, the pictures that you're seeing kind of on the middle and right, proposed curb can be done essentially where it's a very low profile deck. And then on the right, where we've got heights greater than 30 inches, we would have to put a railing on it. But it's a pretty quintessential DCR boardwalk bridge crossing with wood rail. And you can kind of see the image of the aerial and highlighted in blue. That's a typical, there's lots of these little things that are where the outlets and drainage channels are coming off of Quinobequin heading to the Charles. So these would bridge those. Next slide. Next are the boardwalks, and this is closer to Route 9. These are the larger structures that we would use in the blue you can see there in the aerial that are essentially going to allow us to traverse that side slope, which is limited in terms of its lateral ability because of the steep slopes that we're up against and the fairly tight inside corner turn on the road. This allows us to essentially get away from the road and traverse up that slope at a less than 5%. What you're seeing here on the left is a fairly recent install of a boardwalk where you're seeing the warm earth tones of the natural wood, and then which is handsome. But then in theory, the weathered wood in the center picture, which is where it silvers, is really just as equally as handsome, fairly low maintenance, and is quite a nice aesthetic in terms of trying to keep it as natural as possible and not feel too engineered. One of the ways that you minimize, and Pete had mentioned in section, he showed these helical piles. This is an image of what these helical piles actually look like. If you can imagine, just it's a corkscrew that basically goes into the earth that allows you to minimize the amount of excavation and erosion that happens for install of these. So it's a pretty clever way to do it. And it's pretty impactful because it still allows floral and fauna to kind of migrate around it, under it, and through it, which is quite nice. Next slide, please. Next, we have the scenic overlooks. As Pete said, there's quite a few vistas and long views up and down the river that we want to try to take advantage of. And just one picture here on the left is an existing view. This one isn't quite as long view, but there are probably half a dozen up and down the corridor. And we can do it many different ways. We can do it if we want an at-grade kind of a rock overlook where we get closer to the water and grades permit it, and we have the ability to get down closer to the water. Then maybe we do it using boulders and natural materials. In other locations where grade may not permit it and we need to be coming in a little bit higher, we get elevated with a deck overlook. And there's countless deck overlooks up and down the Charles River reservation that have been done in the past. Next slide, please. Next is the parking and pedestrian crossing, and really pedestrian crossing slash traffic calming. And I think that there's obviously lots of side roads that people can pull off and park on. Also an opportunity, I think, in some of these options, like Pete was saying, to have kind of parallel pull-off zones, these emergency pull-off zones, these service, delivery truck, the Amazon truck, whoever is coming by to drop material off at these houses that are along the Quinobequin Road. There's that opportunity for those vehicles in certain locations. And then obviously there's small parking lots that the DCR is known for, which are small, single loaded, pretty small, not meant for high volume cars, just a place to pull off in case you don't want to pull off on the side of the road. And then raised crosswalks are an approach that we discussed at some of the key intersections along the corridor. And as long as I think the transitions of those raised crosswalks are large enough that it doesn't impede emergency vehicles, it may be worth exploring. Next slide, please. And so the last slide here is really just kind of talking about all of the nice site elements that typically you find on DCR projects. And if you've been on trails and DCR projects before, these are pretty standard and typical elements that come out and are welcome. So in this one, we have a kayak launch. There is an actual kayak launch out there today. It's fairly informal. So maybe we look to more formalize it, or maybe add another one in another location for a drop-off, pickup kind of situation. Trailheads, these would only probably occur at 9 and 95 at the ends of the trail. These aren't meant for mid-block or mid-corridor kind of annotation, I guess you'd say, but they're meant for kind of the end. So they have this granite pier with what we would have obviously is the iconic blue heron, which is typical of the Charles River granite piers, and then specialty pavement to help highlight and signify that you're entering a special place. Wood guardrails are pretty prevalent on DCR projects. This one in the image is actually a steel-backed wood guardrail, which is a crash-rated vehicular guardrail, which you wouldn't necessarily know from this view. And that's ultimately what we would be proposing for any kind of vehicular required guardrail, but also you can simplify this and keep the same character just to make it a pedestrian looking guardrail as well. So maintaining that continuity, I think, within that material vocabulary is a good thing. And then lastly, a lot of these little fun educational signage, interpretive boulders, we call them, that you find sprinkled in kind of around different trails. It's more of a discovery type of thing, but you're getting kind of exposure to the local floral and fauna that is out there. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey for a little summary matrix.
Excellent. So Rick and Pete, thank you so much for walking us through that. And for this evening, we wanted to spend a little bit of that quality time walking you through each of those three alternatives so that you can understand the differences, not only in terms of the alignment and but also in terms of some of the kit parts that Rick just walked us through as well. And hopefully you've heard that there's a lot of flexibility along the length and along those elements that could happen as well. So what we thought we'd also do before we open it up for Q&A is do a little bit of a recap in terms of the assessment criteria matrix that was developed. And a reminder, as Jenna mentioned early in the conversation this evening, that a lot of work went into understanding really the elements that we'd be evaluating. Pete gave us an overview of the dozen different elements that we had, the objectives that we're trying to meet here as well. And really this comes out through a whole bunch of robust conversations from us as a team, having walked the site and being able to have a lot of great conversations about what should be in these different categories, from the listening session that we had with the community to following up with the town, and even through DCR in terms of some of the internal conversations. A lot of work went into this as well. We find that when we put a certain matrix like this together, it's one of many ways that we can actually try to start to assess the different alternatives that we have put forth. And clearly tonight, we want to hear what you think about the assessment of these alternatives. A couple quick things to note here that are some of the trade-offs that I think you've heard Pete and Rick talk about. If you simply look at some of the categories here, especially along the top about some of the archaeological resource preservation, given some of the interventions that we're talking about between the 21st century parkway, which really was reducing some of that cross section, versus sharing the road, so forth. Look at some of the numbers that we've come up here in terms of some of the best applications and maybe some of the ones that aren't quite as good. Another area really that jumped out to us was really between the traffic calming, the safety, the accessibility, about some of the differences between those three schemes that we shared with you tonight as well. And even some of the cost implications, if you look down at the bottom here, so some of the more affordable options versus some of the more expensive options. So we really wanted to offer this back to you tonight as different ways of thinking about how we can evaluate this together. We'd love to hear from you a little bit more about some of your preferences here as well, so that as we move forward as a team, try to start to synthesize some of this and get to that preferred direction as well. So we really kind of found this as a helpful tool, and thank you again for the input that you gave us into thinking about some of these critical elements, because we learned a lot through those conversations as well. So with that, what we'd like to do is really start to have you think about some of the different prompting questions here, in terms of what do you like about what you saw? What are some of the top assessment criteria from your perspective that you really think should resonate with the alternatives? What is your preferred alternative? And most importantly, why? The whole design team can't wait to hear from you about some of your preferences, about what really rises to the top in that conversation as well. And in terms of some of the reference materials that we have to get the conversation going tonight, we'll probably leave this slide up for most of the conversation, because we think it quite simply captures the differences between these three schemes. But again, keep in mind, as Rick and as Pete said, there's some flexibility with this to really divert around some trees, or really take the best of the length of that corridor to really bring it to life as well. So with that, let me reintroduce Jenny Norwood on our team as well. Jenny's going to be working with me to facilitate the conversation here as well. And I think, as Jenna mentioned, that we'd love to open up to some of our representatives with that. So with that, Jenny, if you want to join the conversation and maybe introduce some of the elected officials, would be wonderful.
Representative Balzer is with us. If you could, Jeffrey, turn on her mic and let her speak.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the evening is I'll be inviting you to come off mute. So look for that button for me, and something should show up on your desktop. So let me go here. So if you get the invite from me, you can actually come off of mute. Would be great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Well, the good news is that this process is happening. I guess it started with a lot of the neighbors who I hope are on this call being in touch with me and letting me know a number of things. I mean, one, there's been longstanding safety concerns and longstanding concerns about wanting to really enjoy this gem of a neighborhood and this resource that's here. And because I heard from so many of you, I was successful in getting some language into what I think was a year ago's budget that launched this study. And so I'm very glad that that process is happening. And the most important part of it is the community conversation about it. I would have liked it if this was the kind of Zoom I'm more used to and we could have all seen each other and I could have seen a participant list and I could have felt like I know who's out there. But perhaps DCR will print a list of who participated as part of the report so we can all at least know. During this pandemic, I like as much as possible to try to replicate the in-person experience that we're all missing so much. But I do see a note that there are 39 people attending. There may be some Newton City councilors who you may want to recognize. But mainly, I'm eager to hear from the folks in the community about where you think we should go from here. I'm really here to listen to that and to support all of you in making this, a community that we can all feel safe in and enjoy. So I turn it back to all of you.
Great. Thank you for that. We really appreciate that as well. Really do.
One quick, we got a note from Andrea Downs, who's a Newton City councilor. Andrea, would you like to speak? If you'd like to speak, raise your hand and Jeffrey will unmute you. There she is.
Great. Give me 1 second. If you'd like to join the conversation, that would be great.
Hi, this is very exciting. And great to see all of the alternatives and the detail and the level of thought that you've given to what we have, particularly when it comes to, I think what I hear most about is besides water, is speed on Quinobequin and trees. There's a lot of concern about trees and preserving trees, and we in the neighborhood have been active in doing not just cleanups, but also invasive removals to try to preserve our trees, including some very massive bittersweet vines, where you really, they were almost as big as the trees themselves. And so this is very exciting. I have a couple of questions, but I'll leave it to the community and I've sent some in by email, but I will continue to be engaged just to make sure that we're all hearing from our residents and users of this park. So before I go any further, I'll just sign off with that. But thank you so much for this. This is a lot to think about. And I look forward to hearing and reading comments.
Great. Thank you for that too. And thanks for taking on the battle with the invasives too. Hopefully we'll get them to be smaller than some of the great trees that are out there as well. So thank you for that. Jenny, are there anyone else we'd like to recognize?
No, I think, why don't we go to the couple of hands that are raised first, and then we can go to reading the questions. So
excellent. Well, thank you.
Hand raising.
Great. So if folks, again, want to raise their hand, we'll invite you to come off of mute by me clicking on a button here as well. So we have Alexander. If you'd like to join the conversation, I'm going to invite you to come off mute. Can you hear us, Alexander?
Yes, I can. Thank you. I just hear you now. Do you want me to make a statement?
If you'd like to make a statement or a comment, we'd welcome your feedback.
Okay, well, I hate to be so caustic, but I've been looking at this for a while. I've been walking, I'm 80 years old. I've been walking the Quinobequin Trail for about 25 years, spring, summer, and fall, and even in the winter. It is lovely and peaceful, in my humble opinion, just the way it is. It's a rare treasure of nature for us, and especially for the wildlife whose home it actually is, and whose lives depend on it, and who unquestionably deserve to have it protected from our intrusive meddling. Please, no gravel, no planks. Now I'm talking about the trail itself now, no bikes, and please, no contractors with hideous, noisy, polluting equipment, terrifying and poisoning the birds, rabbits, squirrels, and so on. Please leave the simple, narrow dirt walking trails as they are. Please preserve this rare treasure, please. If you do anything, please restrict it to alternative 1 only, please. And please, no parking along the road. It's already restricted. I don't know why you want to open that up, other than to get more and more people to wreck the wonderful natural scenery and natural preserve that's there now. The other 2 alternatives, I believe, are totally destructive of this treasure, and I believe both are outrageous. Alternative 1 is only even remotely acceptable option, in my opinion, for any change to this priceless, irreplaceable treasure. And frankly, Mr. Williams has proposed, I can't believe what he's proposed. Boardwalks, metal, this and that would totally wreck the entire area. From his presentation, it doesn't seem to me he cares anything about preserving this treasure. I mean, he'd make it into another Central Park. So I'm sorry, but this is very upsetting. As I say, I have treasured this area for over 25 years. It's one of the last remaining bits of nature here in close to Boston. Please don't wreck it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. We really appreciate your comments as well, and appreciate you identifying which options out of the 3 you prefer. And knowing that if we tie this back to some of the goals and some of the objectives and the different perspectives that we're trying to achieve, obviously there's a balance between those things. So thank you for sharing your perspective. We really appreciate that as well. Let's go on to Lee. Lee, would you like to join the conversation?
Thank you very much. I'm Lee Fisher. I live on Chestnut Street in Newton Upper Falls. I love Quinobequin. I would be very disappointed if it was one way because I like driving it in both directions. If I lived on Quinobequin or any of the roads going up from Quinobequin, I'd have a fit about the one way because it complicates how you get home to your house, depending on which direction you're coming from. There's a carbon footprint about all the extra driving, let alone the time. So, but I'll let other people argue against the one-way solution. I guess my real question and comment, all 3 of your alternatives show the sidewalk on the residential side. And it would be great to have a continuous sidewalk, yes, but the residential side has something like 11 different roads and curb cuts. If you have a wheelchair or something like that, if you're even just going for an evening stroll, you've got to deal with intersection after intersection after intersection. When you put it on the residential side. If you put the sidewalk on the river side, you have a lovely continuous walking path with no concern about cross traffic, no curb cuts. So I would suggest a 4th alternative where the sidewalk moves to the river side, and then just make it a little wider and let it be the shared use path. So it's people and bikes like you show. And then this would allow the trail shown in alternative 3 to continue to be, the simple natural trail that the previous person just spoke about. Can you explain why you can't move the sidewalk to the riverside for a more pleasant walk and widen it a bit to make it a shared use path? so that we get rid of the orange. We have a purple to the riverside of the 2-lane road, and we have a nice, sweet little simple trail along the river.
Sure. Pete, that might be a good question for you in terms of the mobility and the connectivity in terms of those different facilities from pedestrian perspective.
Yeah, I think to respond to the sidewalk on the residential side, we had heard that there are several people that were interested in that. And, you know, there's certain complete streets requirements that we focus on as we put these together. But, you know, during the alternate one conversations, that's why I brought up the fact that we do have a redundant walkway here, and maybe there is some possibility of taking that out of a concept like an alternative like alternative one, where we could use just the shared use path as the main mobility for pedestrians.
Right. I think down in alternative number 2, for example, where we're proposing that facility to be off to the right there, the ability to connect out to that actually undulates as you go down the length of the river. So getting out to that might be a little bit challenging as you go down the length of the road as
it
well.
does. And you would have to have crossings at every road. And so, yeah, it does create some problems in both the other alternatives, and certainly in alternative 3. There's a safety issue out there today. I've walked that thing, and walking in the road is not a comfortable experience. It really warrants, under the existing condition, a sidewalk on that residential side.
Great.
And I'd just add, Lee, Tom McCarthy, our Director of Universal Accessibility, was also part of our project team. And he and his colleague, Rachel Lee, agree that the residences need to have an accessible route to the trail and to the crosswalks. And we, as Pete was suggesting, we'd hate to have them traveling in the roadway to get to a crosswalk, or potentially jaywalking across the road. We feel, as we've said, that there might be a kit of parts. There may be a hybrid scheme where, especially where there are no residences, at Irwin Street, for instance, there's a long stretch of wetland on the residential side. We could have a crosswalk, a safe cross passage for those residences, and then no sidewalk, which would improve the section as regards resource protection. So it's a great point. It's a great question, and we definitely see that it's additional impervious surface. But from a universal accessibility and complete streets point of view, it's something that we were asked to test.
Yeah, well, that's true. My suggestion would require that you cross Quinobequin to get to the sidewalk. So I do understand that. Okay, thank you for answering.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate that as well. And let's go to one more before we go to the Q&A. Let's go to Jeremy. Jeremy, if you'd like to join the conversation.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Thank you for having me. So I want to thank you all for the time and effort that you have spent. I second the other comments with respect to the amount of detail. It really is much appreciated. It's great that you're listening to the neighbors. It really does feel like we are collaborating together on this. With respect to my personal comments, I live on Quinobequin. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old daughter, and safety is my #1 priority. I've seen uptick in the speed of vehicles since 2016 when Quinobequin was paved. I don't have any data to support that. I just have my own ears and my own eyes, which constantly and consistently hear cars and motorcycles revving at extreme speeds. The more I hear today, I do not think that reducing it to one road is the answer. Immediately upon seeing the alternative options, I just went to alternative 1, 21st Century Parkway, for 1 lane. And I was extremely excited that that was the option. However, as I'm here sitting, I'm listening to cars zooming by, literally. And it's one-way issue. So I don't think having it one-way or two-way is really going to change that. The obviously you all have been thinking long and hard about this, and you know much better than I do. I don't have an expertise in this, and I'm sensitive to emergency vehicles, but I think within the amount of technology and the brain power and experience that you all have, there must be some way to create some type of speed bump, for lack of a better word. I understood that the crossings could be a little raised, but I've been around Newton for many years, and I do notice that some of the streets do in fact have some sort of raised speed bumps, and it is a drastic difference. It is no longer a place where people and motorcycles and fancy fast cars enjoy literally going 60, 70 miles an hour. I see it with my own eyes every day, all the time. And it's extremely upsetting for my family and for myself and for all of the people that are walking, including Alexander, who I see him walking all the time, all throughout the year. And I would love to continue that environment and not feel fear for his safety and my daughters and other people coming to the area. So I'll just quickly say that the two objectives that I heard was safety as well as having people enjoy the area. I think, and I don't want to make any assumptions, that safety was really the impetus for this. And I would hate to see that, quote unquote, the beautification of this process really taking over and trumping safety. I am all for beautification. I loved what I heard, but I have to agree with Alexander that the river and the area itself is absolutely beautiful, and it doesn't need all the bells and whistles. I love my bells and whistles, but I don't think that this is the right place for it. And I'll just end that I think safety was the impetus, and I would just really recommend and really ask again for us to concentrate on how do we stop the cars, whether it be 1 lane or 2 lane, from speeding down the road, hurting people and potentially killing people. So with that said, I really do appreciate your time and energy on this, and I'm really excited for this project. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for that as well. And also thank you for letting us know your preferences in terms of some of the criteria that we talked about. And as I noted on one of my examples, that some of the safety differences, there are some differences between some of these schemes. So we really appreciate you giving us that feedback. It's really, really helpful as well. With that, maybe Jenny, if you want to jump in here with a couple of questions from our audience as well, would be great.
Okay, from Chris Pitts, we have in alternate 3, what's the green mean under the path? That's first. And then could you give examples of what water quality features are?
Right, that might be going for Rick. Rick, you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. So the green represented in alternate 3 is the enhanced stabilized aggregate path. Basically, it's the gravel path that would be used to essentially create an accessible surface, and where maybe not all areas could meet ADA compliance in terms of accessibility due to using the existing trail and the topography that's out there. We can also take on some of the U.S. forestry accessibility guidelines that would maybe be a little bit lesser of in terms of strict kind of rules and regulations, but still provides better access than what's out there today. In terms of the stormwater amenities, that was really kind of goes back to the slide that talked about rain gardens, bioremediation, bioretention areas, and vegetated swale areas. Those are kind of the tools you would use for that.
Okay, I've got 4 questions from Jim Lerner. First is Pete mentioned that alternative 2 might have a 20-foot wide impact, 10-foot path plus 2 foot on each of the shoulders. Why the extra 6 feet?
I think that's in kind of a worst case scenario. We know that the trees are really close together here. And once you start getting in excavating root structure and so forth, there's a good chance that you're going to start affecting more trees than you would anticipate. The 20 foot is, if I misspoke, is probably more of the canopy of the tree as opposed to, taking out 20 foot of trees. So the intent obviously would be to minimize any tree removal out here, but I think it's just an important talking point to understand that, you know, it is quite invasive to put a 10-foot shared use path through the wooded area. Certainly there's opportunities to revegetate and replant trees after we're done, but, you know, I think the first path through there is probably a little surprising to people.
I think the one part I just might add to that is, having walked the corridor with the team, the sensitivity that I know the team's taking to try to put that in the right spot to be able to stay away from wetlands and be in the right location to maximize, or really in this case, minimize some of those impacts to the extent possible as well.
So that is, the 20 feet is a worst case scenario. We do have greenways where we narrow the width of the trail. It no longer complies with the AASHTO guidelines, but it has been done. We have a project in Medford called Clippership Connector, where we're going down to 8.5 feet. And we can wind around trees, as Jeffrey was just suggesting. So we can do it with the greatest degree of sensitivity, but we do have to be aware when you go in to excavate this area for the base, you're destroying rooting zone. Those tree feeder roots are in the top 6 inches of soil, and you might be hitting some roots that stabilize the tree, rendering it a hazard. So it is possible that a tree a few feet away that you would think in a plan could be saved cannot be saved. So we just want to make people aware that, of course, DCR, if we proceeded with a scheme like this, it would be designed with utmost sensitivity, but it is construction, and so there would be impacts, and then we would remediate those impacts in areas where there are invasives. As we said earlier, it's a great opportunity to remove those invasives and restore the landscape with native species.
So related, could alternative 2 or 3 be moved closer to the river and further from the road? I believe he's talking about the path.
Could you say that again one more time, Jenny, please?
In alternatives 2 and 3, could the path be moved closer to the river and further from the road?
Right. I think maybe Rick, you can answer this one too, but I think if you followed some of the diagrams that we walked through, the specific location actually varies down the length of the road as well. In some cases, it's close to the road, some cases further away, but could it get even closer to the river? Rick, what's some response to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are locations where the existing trail is obviously, you know, right on the bank or right close to the bank, which is that opportunity to get close. I think these were the typical sections. If we cut a half a dozen other sections, you might see that purple line or that green line are, you know, 1.5 pages over to the right, which would represent it actually is a lot closer to the river. So these are typical sections. They don't necessarily represent a specific you know, place or a consistent offset distance from the road. These will move back and forth. And the bottom one, alternate 3, is truly what the existing trail is today. We, you know, walked it, flagged it, basically made sure that, you know, we were consistently following it and traced it in those plans. That dashed line that you saw in those plans represents that existing trail, and that's really what the intent was to reuse that existing trail.
And I think, Rick, it's also important to point out that the closer we are to the river's edge, the more likelihood that we're within resource areas and habitat, and, you know, going to create issues with them. And putting it closely to the existing paths that are already disturbed areas, footprints through the woods, if you will, it really helps us minimize those impacts.
Great. Jenny, one more question, then we'll go back to the folks on audio.
Sure. From Jim Lerner again, crossing Quinobequin at the Route 128 tunnel seems quite dangerous. Also, if it is continued to Route 16, it will have to cross the highway exit or entrance ramps.
Jenny, I can address that.
Jenny,
as some of you know, we have an adjacent project called the Lower Falls Shared Use Trail Feasibility Study. It's running about a parallel schedule with this project. And in coordination with the City of Newton and with some consultation with MassDOT, we decided that the placeholder location for that stretch of Quinobequin north of this project area, northwest, would and stretching from the I-95 underpass to Route 16 would be on the riverside of the underpass. So by continuing the riverside, by giving Quinobequin and the on-ramp a road diet, shrinking the pavement and increasing the adjacent area, we could fit in a shared use trail, have a safe crosswalk, probably signalized crosswalk across the on-ramp, and then give a road diet to the portion of Quinobequin to the north to get people safely to Route 16. It is contrary to expectation that putting a crosswalk across a highway on-ramp would be safe, but by extending the ramp, we would give those cars enough time to accelerate onto highway traffic. So we need to coordinate that with MassDOT. We have also asked MassDOT about the elimination of those ramps, and they gave a wonderful answer. That is a large planning effort that we would have to evaluate very carefully. There are other changes going on with planning initiatives in the vicinity. So that's something that they may look at. So these are all placeholders for future design and construction projects. But we feel strongly that while it's good to have a crosswalk at Verac, the shared use trail should stay on the riverside.
Great. Thank you for that, Jenna. That was great. So let's go back to a couple of folks that are going to be able to join in by audio. So let's go to Maria. Maria, I'm going to invite you to join the conversation.
Hi, everyone. This is Maria Gorsica. I live on Quinobequin Road. I've been a resident here for 24 years. A special hello to my friend Peter Sorensen. I know you guys have a great team, and I love your project and your solutions. I wasn't able to participate in your earlier briefing, so I'm really excited to hear about it. As a resident here, I have never walked on that path across the way because of the condition. So I really look forward to improving that, so I would use it in an improved state. I really appreciate the focus on the safety, particularly for the pedestrians. I've always wanted a sidewalk in front of my house on the home side. My children could never walk to their friend's house on Quinobequin. They could never go trick-or-treating to the neighbors because it's so dark and unsafe. So I think that's a great enhancement. And I do like all of the alternatives. I really think that what I've seen since COVID and people in this neighborhood have really been using this resource and out walking and enjoying the outdoors. I feel like they have discovered the path along Quinobequin and the ability to bicycle and walk in this beautiful neighborhood. And I feel like alternate 2, even though in your rating scheme, it really flags some significant permitting and environmental challenges that you would need to overcome, I think it is a great public benefit, and would be highly used.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Maria, as well. I'm hoping that all the kids can go out trick-or-treating soon too. So looking forward to those days, believe me. So thanks for the comment, really appreciate that. Let's go over to John. John, if you'd like to join the conversation.
Hello, this is John Mortis. I am the president of the Friends of Hemlock Gorge, and I've lived in Woburn for 42 years. I commend you for the detail and thoughtfulness that went into your presentation. Just briefly, that I would say that I, particularly as the president of Friends of Hemlock Gorge, am in agreement with Alexander about the character of the current forest trail and would like to see it preserved. I have used it in that condition for the last 40-odd years. My one primary concern in regard to safety and design is to implement the sidewalks. I find sidewalks to be the pedestrian's best friend wherever they exist. Pedestrian sidewalks are maintained and cleared of snow in the winter, cleared of leaves in the fall. And I would encourage whatever proposal is finally decided on to include the sidewalks as a priority. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, John. And let's go to Chris. Chris, would you like to join the conversation?
Sure.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good, good. I'm the president of the Waban Area Council, and we actually have to, our meeting takes place in about 15 minutes. But
I'm glad we got you in real quick, Chris.
I echo what John was saying. We've actually held a couple of meetings of the Friends of the Quinobequin. Many of the people are also part of the Friends of Hemlock Gorge, which John is president of, as you mentioned. And there's notes on our website regarding the meeting that we had, and Representative Balzer was part of that. I think we have a lot of the issues that you're talking about, and we really do appreciate that you brought in some real heavy specialists to do this study and to do it seriously. I have a couple of questions for you real quickly. I assume that the 1, 2, 3 is also the order of what the cost would be for implementing these solutions.
Yeah, Jenna, you might want to clarify that too, but I think the order of the numbers was less in terms of priority or any significance versus just having the themes behind them, right?
Sure, but
that's right. Pete can probably talk best to the cost, but I want to just emphasize that the cost assessment criteria includes full depth reconstruction of the roadway and other improvements to drainage and lighting. So you might think that share the road would be less cost, but it would include the full depth reconstruction of that road to accomplish all those things. And additionally, both alternative 2 and alternative 3 have the very long stretches of boardwalk just north of Route 9. And so that is to provide safe pedestrian access, because that space isn't really available within the roadway right of way at those locations. So while you think that alternative 2 and 3 might be considerably cheaper, in fact, alternative 1 does not have that stretch of boardwalk. So there is a savings there. But Pete, do you want to give any further detail?
Yeah, it actually turns out that alternative 2 is the most expensive, and it's really the boardwalk and the little extra construction to build the path off road that actually bumps it up. But to Gina's point, they're actually all pretty close. They're within a range of 15% between the 3 of them.
But the alternative 3 road plan, could that not be, because really that seems to me more like restriping the existing road. Since you have limits of existing pavement is carved out there, and it just seems like, and we've discussed this in the meetings, Councilor Andrea Downs addresses this quite a bit, but that we could conceivably accomplish this with restriping the road.
Yes, you could. I think for consistency, we were considering all 3 alternatives to have full depth reconstruction. And a lot of that was predicated based on, we're going to do drainage improvements. So there'll be some excavation in the road, upgrading the facilities. So there was a lot of reasons for that. I think, alternative 3 provides a lot of options here. There's from a phasing standpoint, there's a lot of things we can do. You could get the same output in alternative 3 under its existing condition without doing a lot of the modifications. So to your point, yes, there's ways we can reduce costs and timing of the various alternatives.
Well, I appreciate that, you're looking to do things properly and not shortchange any of the take any shortcuts regarding what needs to happen, especially for drainage in that area, which is long overdue being fixed. And as Lee pointed out, Lee Fisher pointed out, there's quite a few things along the sidewalk, which actually disappears at times. So, I mean, that's something the city needs to deal with. City or state, I'm not sure who, but somebody needs to deal with that before, regardless of all three of these alternatives, that those sidewalks, as somebody mentioned, are really, the pedestrian's friend. So that needs to happen anyways. But we're very happy that you have gone down this road, and it looks like you have plans that will really help us go out and ask for proper funding for some of these things. So.
Right.
Thank you for that, Chris. Really appreciate that. Let's do one more on the audio, and then Jenny, we're going to go back to you. So let's go to Jeff, if you'd like to join the conversation. So Jeff, if you'd like to join the conversation.
Hello, I'm Jeff Gellis. I live in Waban. I am concerned about bicycle safety in alternative 3. I understand that the plan for that includes restriping the road, but as a bicyclist, I regard that as sort of not adequate to ensure the safety of cyclists on the road, especially given the limited sight lines along the road. I also have a question. I wanted to ask whether there's been a traffic study done and what effect converting the road to a one-way would have on traffic in the neighboring areas.
Excellent. Pete, would you like to answer that question about what our team has been able to do so far?
Yeah, so, obviously the traffic out has been a mess due to COVID. One of the things that we did back at the end of August, so our firm does a lot of traffic analysis for Mass DOT, and one of the things that they've been finding is traffic volumes have actually been coming back in a lot of areas, but they're not seeing the spikes like AM and PM peak hours. They're seeing more of a flattening of the curve, if you will. So we thought that similar would be happening out here. So we did do a 48-hour count on Quinobequin Road. And it was interesting that we found that we're getting pretty close to levels. So on another project, we had done traffic counts up Route 16 and had some information on Quinobequin Road. And we were getting about 2,000 vehicles a day. And currently, under the latest in that 48-hour count, we were finding about 1,900 vehicles a day. So we're really getting close to the same traffic numbers as we saw before. Relative to the one-way traffic, pretty much the higher volume is the northbound, and it varies over the course of the day. It runs from anywhere from 50 to 70 cars an hour, for a total of around 800 or 900 cars per day. We did look at that just to see if there was any big concerns with going with the one-way traffic. At this point, we don't see. Certainly, if we follow this alternative into the next phase, into the concept development, to the next phase, and we get better traffic counts, we'll do a full traffic signal analysis on the abutting areas to make sure that we're not pushing traffic in other, whether it be in Wellesley or overtaxing some of the other intersections. We're not talking a lot of volume here, but we're pretty confident in the numbers that we've seen that we can accommodate one-way traffic.
Great, thank you for that. And Jeff, thank you for the question as well. I really appreciate that as well. So I think, Jenny, let's go back to you. I see that we got a couple people that might have signed off. Back to the Q&A.
Okay, related question, in alternative 1, why would the traffic go northbound?
Yeah, Pete, I think we actually did look at that pretty carefully as well. You want to answer that one about why northbound versus southbound for the one-way?
Well, in the quick analysis, it seemed like it was the most logical direction. We had the higher volume of traffic. I know we're looking at reducing traffic, but I think it was the direction that actually had the most desire line to go in that south to north direction. Presumably we could go both in either of the directions, but this seemed to make more sense.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Next, thank you all for your hard work and time on this project. The safety of residents on Quinobequin and visitors to the Charles is a priority that I know you all share. With that being said, a one-way single car road is the #1 choice by far. With that being said, was there any discussion to creating some type of speed bumps?
Right, I think we talked about that through one of the earlier questions about the importance of that, especially on any of these facilities as well. So I think that's something that the team can come back and look at as well. So thank you for that, Jenny.
Okay. And then next, Pete mentioned a connection to Echo Bridge across Route 9. Is there any possibility of a boardwalk over the river under Route 9?
Yeah, maybe Jenna, you might want to mention that one.
You want to take that one?
Sure, we haven't pursued that. We certainly have a lot of precedents of underpasses under highway bridges, keeps you down closer to the river. They're tricky to permit because of the storage capacity of the floodplain, and we do have to be mindful of the release of water to manage the flows of the Charles. It's something that we could look at. I think there might be some accessibility difficulties on the Hemlock Gorge side, and also some difficulties with accessibility getting from Quinobequin down to the water's edge on Quinobequin Road side. As Pete mentioned, it's about 20 feet grade change from the road down to the water. So it wasn't a part of this project because we were trying to solve the pedestrian and bicycle safety along Quinobequin right now, but it's certainly something that could be added at a later time. None of the work we're doing now precludes adding that wonderful passage under the river.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I've got one. What is the lifespan of helical supports?
Pete, that might be a question for you, or Rick, if you know that as well. Yeah,
that's a good question. I don't have.
I don't have an answer. Yeah,
I don't have an answer on that. I know we've seen them. I've seen them where they've been in for 30 years.
Yeah, likewise.
But I don't know the actual anticipated life expectancy.
Great. So probably that question has to do about durability and longevity. So we can keep that comment in mind as we're thinking about the next phase about designing construction details and so forth. So thank you for that. And Jenny, I know there's a lot of questions, so maybe we can try to keep on going through those because there's a lot of really good ones here. Some of them simple to answer too.
Yeah, what will happen to southbound traffic in alternative 1?
Pete, I think that would be good for you.
They'll actually find alternate routes. That's the obvious answer. The interesting thing is, what we found, there was another study done. It wasn't part of this project. And we saw that they had done a license plate study. And a lot of the traffic on Quinobequin Road, according to this particular study, was actually local traffic. The through traffic that actually went from Route 16 to Route 9 was only in the range of 10 to 15%. I know that's counterintuitive to some of the conversations we've heard, but so I think it's an interesting statistic. So a lot of it is local traffic, and they would just filter down through the neighborhood, perhaps from Chestnut Street or roadways above.
Great. Thank you. Jenny?
Okay, could permeable tarmac be used for any paved surfaces?
That's a good question.
So the city of Newton expressed a preference for asphalt for the greenway. So we want to be mindful of that. However, I will add that the DCR ecologists expressed a preference for permeable pavement, and we are developing the means to maintain it. You have to vacuum pervious pavement twice a year to keep those void spaces where the water flows through free of sand and gravel and leaf debris. And so we are developing the means to do that. In the floodplain, though, it would be very difficult to keep those pervious pavements pervious, because there would be sediments coming, very fine silty sediments coming from the river as well. Pete or Rick, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you hit the main points, Jenna, and I know we had this discussion, I believe, with Tom when we were out doing the site walk, and he indicated that they do have some of the equipment to do that. I think we would probably recommend keeping it to the shared use path only, especially in alternate one, for the reasons that you discussed. You know, once you get down into the lower lands that are subject to flooding, it does become an issue.
The only thing I would add to it is typically with those systems, you have a much deeper aggregate base that you need for volume capacity. So if you're running through existing woodland, that's that much more excavation you're having to do, which ultimately creeps out laterally from the edge of the path.
And Jenny, let me take a break here and we'll go to Maureen, who's raised her hand as well. So Maureen, if you'd like to join the conversation.
I was in the process of writing out a question. I wanted to share my priorities, which would be safety first, followed by drainage improvement, followed by maintenance. Because when I thought about what you guys might put forward, and I'm in support of increasing greater accessibility for all users, I thought those three needed to come first, because without the focus being on those three priorities, whatever accessibility is created, would be affected if one of those three wasn't attended to. I'm in support of a sidewalk on the residential side, because in the years I've lived here, although I don't have kids, when I've gone door to door and talked to people, there's a significant change in the neighborhood in the time I've lived here, of houses turning over to young families with young kids again. And that's a consistent observation, is the frustration, feeling unsafe, walking their kids or letting their kids walk on their own, in the inconsistent sidewalk on the resident side. So I just wanted to make that observation. And I don't really have an alternative. I appreciate the time to kind of absorb the three design ideas you presented. And I greatly appreciate the DCR coming to the table for our neighborhood and bringing such a breadth of skill sets to come forward with these different ideas. I hope there can be, whatever design is chosen could offer greater accessibility to give people, with my friends in the neighborhood, we're all that have enjoyed the path for the time we've lived here, but that enjoyment isn't shared by everybody because of the difficulty for people that aren't as able-bodied to get down by the river. And the last thing I'd say is I was surprised that the push for accessibility went all the way to Route 9, because I had thought that most of the parkland is at a relatively flat grade. And I was afraid that needing to bring accessibility all the way up to Route 9 would end up being too costly. So thank you for your, and I didn't want it to end up, I thought we could have greater accessibility for most of the parkland, which is better, 100% better than what we have currently. I love it too in its natural state, but it comes at a price of not being available for everybody. So thank you.
Great. Maureen, thank you so much for those comments. And I can tell you, in prepping for these types of meetings, our whole team gets excited about having the opportunity to talk to the community and really value what you've got out there. So just hearing that from you and your words was really helpful as well. So we really appreciate that.
And Maureen, after the question and answer is over, we'll have the website links for public comment. So absolutely, you know, this is so much information, and we've been spending several months wrapping our heads around it, but definitely want you to reference the presentation, which will be available, the PowerPoint will be available, and then links for public comment. And the public comment period will be open until October 23rd.
Excellent. So
Okay.
Jenny, back to you.
Sure. Two asking questions about proposed developments. So both the impact of Riverside and the proposed footbridge from Wellesley Office Park to Larkspur Road, and the number of residents that will be built there. What's the impact of those two developments on what we're proposing for Quinobequin Road?
Yeah, I'm not sure who best. Jenny, maybe have a macro answer to that one too, in terms of the context of what's going on?
Sure. Well, the proposed projects at Riverside are something that DCR has been studying for many, many years. As many of you know, many of you have participated and advocated for those trails studies and the implementation of our vision. So the Charles River Reservation Greenway is something that we see connecting all of DCR's parklands. So it's a regional asset as well as a wonderful local parkland asset. Many different phases for each area. Riverside, as many people know, has trail mitigation projects proposed by the MARC Development Project at Riverside Station. DCR is in conversations with the City of Newton and MARC Development on the actual projects and the funding of those projects. So those conversations are ongoing. Nothing specific to report yet, but it is exciting that it's kind of taking shape. I mentioned the Lower Falls feasibility study as well. So the Lower Falls work would have to be complete for the direct connections from Riverside to be formed. And so it's some years off. We're developing these great consensus plans, but like Quinobequin, they are concepts and we have to identify funding as well as prioritize phasing. So as far as the Wellesley office development is concerned, the developers have expressed an interest in proposing a path connection from their existing woodland path to Route 9, and also looking at a road diet along Boylston portion of the Route 9 on-ramp and getting safe passage, safer pedestrian passage over the Charles River. So we think that that's a wonderful idea. As far as I know, it wouldn't necessarily impact anything at Quinobequin, just make for safer pedestrian travel. So we did hear from people in Wellesley, and so I think they would really appreciate that connection. Does that answer the question?
It's perfect.
Yeah. Next, what is the amount of money available for this entire project?
So, Jen, I think that's back to you, right?
So we have to decide on a preferred alternative before we can ask VHB to cost that. That is in their scope of work. So we'll take all the comments we get tonight. We will fold in the public comments that you all enter on our website and synthesize all of that into a preferred alternative. Then we'll be able to cost that and identify funding. When that funding will be available or what the source is not a question we can answer yet, but we're making progress.
Thank you.
In the interest of safety, if you can do nothing else under current budgetary constraint, can you at least do the sidewalks as a phase 1?
Heard a lot of support for the sidewalks, and phasing is certainly going to be a part of the discussion. So we, sometimes we call them early action items. And so that's something that we can discuss.
Why must the project include access to the very end of Quinobequin right up to Route 9? It looks like that stretch is especially expensive.
So I'll jump in. I think we mentioned earlier that is a very tight right of way between the slope to the east and down to the river. And so we couldn't really get a greenway in, and very difficult to get even a 5.5 foot sidewalk or trail for cyclists along that riverside. And that is why we investigated the boardwalk, to complete that safe passage, safety being the primary concern. And that is one of the darkest, most curvilinear locations. So we really wanted to make certain that at the entry to Quinobequin, that there would be a trailhead and then safe passage. As well as, and I think we've mentioned this, coordinate with Mass DOT to get, similar to the 95 underpass, get safe passage under Route 9 and a safe crosswalk to Hemlock Gorge.
Great.
So next, accommodating bikes adds an especially delicate element here. Must bikes be accommodated?
Yeah, Pete, you might want to talk about that one, and Jenna too.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's a lot of users out here, and we really want to provide a safe bike route for them.
Yeah, and so Complete Streets asks us to consider equitable accommodations for all modes of transportation, pedestrians, cyclists, commuter cyclists, family recreational cyclists, and as well as motorists. So I think the answer is yes. I think that we also want to be mindful of all the different kinds of cyclists, and some are very comfortable on road. They have a high level of risk acceptance, and others, especially families with children, want to feel safe, want to have a grade separated shared use trail.
Okay. And just in terms of timekeeping for tonight, we're getting closer to 8:30, so I thought maybe we can do a few more of these, and just before we lose a few people, it might be good just to take a step ahead and talk about next steps, and then we can continue on with these as well. But just wanted to raise that for the team for consideration. So
why don't you put up the next step slide while we go through the questions? Next question: couldn't a pedestrian bridge be affixed to the side of I-95 to gain access to the south side? It would be great to make a loop trail between I-95 and Route 9.
That's a longer term strategy. I think, as we're talking about before, about making this broader connectivity to the region and some of the connectivity and abutting projects there. So clearly that can be thought of for the longer term, right?
Question: are the guardrails for walkers or cars?
Great. Pete, you want to answer that one? Probably benefit for both, right?
They are, but primary, they're going to be for cars and areas specifically like at Dresser Pond or the approach to Route 9, where we have steep slopes off the edge of the roadway. And these are certainly warranted through design standards that we would require these. There are some other places where we may consider the path too close to the roadway, and there may be some consideration for adding them there to protect the pedestrians and the bikers on the shared use path.
Great. And with that, Jenna, maybe we can talk about just quickly about our schedule and about some of those next steps, just for the folks that are on tonight and maybe watching later. Right.
To place the project in context, I spoke earlier about our process and project schedule. But the big arrow is where we are tonight at our second public outreach presentation. And having gone through these three concept alternatives, as we were saying earlier, agreeing with Maureen, it takes a lot to absorb this information. So please do visit the websites we'll give you in the next slide. But the comment period is that green bar, extending till October 23rd. And then during the months of October and November, we'll be synthesizing those comments. We'll have in-house DCR design review in collaboration with VHB's team, and they will develop and submit at the end of November the preferred option. So this will just be a concept design, but it will guide future planning efforts. We'll be able to identify funding. We'll be able to think about, as people suggested, early implementation. Perhaps it's the sidewalk, perhaps it's some other element like crosswalks, and you know, what alternative ultimately gets constructed. So with that, we can go to additional information, Jeffrey. So this is a slide you've seen before. It is the web addresses for our DCR public meetings and projects. So if you want additional information on Quinobequin and want to access the recording of tonight's meeting or see the PowerPoint, you can go to those top two web addresses, mass.gov, DCR past public meetings, and DCR-projects. If you want to submit comments, as we were saying earlier, we sure hope you do, please submit online. The best way to do this, because it is codified into one document, is to submit those comments at mass.gov DCR public-comment. If you have any problems with that, please feel free to reach out to Jenny. Her address is here. It's jennifer.norwood@mass.gov. So again, we mentioned the deadline for public comment is Friday, October 23rd. Please be aware that all of that information that you enter is public and cannot be redacted. But we know that you know we value your opinion, and we hope you'll be willing to share it. And then if you're just interested in DCR projects in general, mass.parks@mass.gov is the place to sign up for that. So with that, Jeffrey, do we have any other questions or hands raised?
We have about no hands raised, but we have maybe 10 or so questions, and maybe we can just spend a few minutes trying to do the quick hitters on that, if that's okay with everybody.
So we know that some of you have other meetings scheduled. Chris Pitts mentioned one. Thank you so much for joining us before your Walman Council meeting. But if anybody wants to stay and run through these additional questions that we received through chat, we're happy to stay for a while longer. So goodbye to those of you who have to leave us. Thank you. And as I said, we'll be here for a moment longer.
Great. So Jenny, with that, back to you real quick.
Sure, I'm going to mush together a couple of questions. First, on the rating screen, I saw bike and pedestrian convenience for criteria, but didn't see car convenience. Is that one of the criteria, asking particularly about inconvenience of one-way and alternative one? And then a related question, why would residents have to change their daily traffic patterns due to one-way restrictions? Seems like anti-neighborhood restriction.
Okay, that's good feedback. So we'll take that. Thank you for that comment.
Next, we have, will there be crosswalks at each street feeding into Quinobequin?
Another really good question, because we know so many community residential homes are connected across the road there. So Pete, what's the plan in terms of all cross sections? Maybe some, all of them?
We'd certainly have strategically crossings of Quinobequin. Ideally, they would be at locations of interim informal trailheads with, you know, depending on the alternative, I think they would all differ. I think you could easily be accommodated on each of the streets. I think to one of the comments earlier, do we really want crosswalks at 11 different side street locations? But, you know, then again, that is part of the traffic calming, and it makes people aware that there are pedestrians out here.
And you quickly realize the interrelationship between the crosswalk and the sidewalk that goes along, so that if you can't get every spot, the importance of that, the longitudinal mobility aspect. Okay, Jenny, back to you.
Would raised crosswalks serve as speed bumps?
Yeah, there probably would be some type of traffic calming element as part of that as well. So yes, that would have
Yes.
a little bit of a benefit.
Yeah.
Who maintains the sidewalks? City or state, and who does snow removal? State. Although we do have some cooperative agreements with cities. If it's generally rule of thumb, if it's a state property, then the state is responsible. Next is a comment. Access to the hospital requires roads to go north if one way. So thank you, Sally, for clarifying that. There's another path on the other side of the river behind the office park that is very accessible. Could physically challenged individuals be directed to that so that Quinobequin side need not be quite as accessible, hence less expensive?
Great.
Well, I just emphasize the phrase universal accessibility. When the Commonwealth puts an investment in one of our parklands, we're required by law to make that investment accessible to all. I think that our universal accessibility group, as I mentioned, led by a landscape architect named Tom McCarthy, understands that persons with physical disabilities like a range of experience. So it doesn't necessarily have to be ADA always, but we do try to accommodate American with Disabilities Act or CMR 521 because it is universal accessibility. And remember, these are families with young children and strollers, as well as wheelchair users, people with physical visual disabilities. So a wide-ranging group needs that. And if they're a resident of Quinobequin, like probably the rest of the neighborhood, they don't want to have to get in their car to enjoy the river.
Thank you.
Okay, and last question. With an average of 2,000 vehicles per day, can you remove the center line to lower speeds on the road?
Repeat that question, might be good for you. Yep.
Yeah, I think that goes back to some of the conversation we had early on when we were talking about alternate 3, where there is some potential to look at some of those progressive alternatives with striping or either bike lanes or bike boulevards, as they call them. And we could certainly look into that. There is some concern there because of the high volumes and speeds, and also some of the sight lines out there for safety reasons that there may be a concern here. But certainly, we could keep an open mind if we go with that alternate 3.
Great, thank you for that, Pete. And I'm not seeing anyone else with a raised hand, and I think we're done with the questions, right, Jenny? So Jenna, if you'd like to close us out for the second time for tonight, would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you in advance for your comments. We've really enjoyed a wonderful collaboration with community groups, with the city. We're collaborating with sister agencies at MassDOT. City of Newton has made archaeological reports available. So it's really been just a tremendous outpouring of support and information. And so we're really a team, and we just want to continue that across the finish line. So again, looking for your comments by October 23rd. And again, thanks for attending.
Good night, everyone.
Good evening.
Good night. Thanks for all your comments.